Good day. Today is Sunday, 2nd February 2025, and I think perhaps the first point to start is by saying that we are now, as it seems to me clear, in the middle of a revolution, or at least an attempted revolution in the United States, in American economic policy, in American foreign policy, and in the way in which the United States is being governed. And a number of things are all happening, each and every one at the same time. We've had the statements from Marco Rubio, the new Secretary of State, which I discussed recently in a recent program, which acknowledged that we've returned to a multipolar world, that the period when the United States was the only great power after the Cold War was anomalous and has ended, and that the United States needs to return to diplomacy and to negotiate on equal terms with the other great powers in its own interests in order to try to avoid conflict. And I mentioned in a recent program how revolutionary in their significance, given the recent foreign policy of the United States, those words of Marco Rubio, which have gone almost completely unreported, actually were. In the meantime, in the United States itself, at the imperial center, if you like, in Washington, a massive purge is underway, affecting increasingly, as has become clear, all branches of the federal government. We've had a massive purge underway in the National Security Council. The moment Mike Waltz came in, he started to suspend people from their positions in the National Security Council. They've been told to make themselves available, to keep themselves available, but they're being put on indefinite leave. Apparently, investigations as to all of the various things that they did are underway. Similar things appear to be happening in the Department of Defense now that Pete Hegseth has been confirmed as Secretary of Defense, though I noticed that General Brown clings on as chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, even as his predecessor, General Milley, is clearly in deep disgrace with his security detail withdrawn from him, and with General Milley denied access to senior intelligence information. In the intelligence community, a similar purge is taking place. Various people who were involved in the various recent scandals and investigations are apparently also being suspended, and in the FBI, the purge that is underway, and I think purge is not too strong a word, is intensifying and is involving more and more people. And perhaps most dramatic of all, we're getting news that in the US Treasury, there's been a power struggle apparently between some officials of the permanent bureaucracy of the US Treasury and Elon Musk, who is, as I understand it, not actually even a formal member of the administration, though he does run this department, DOGE, which is supposed to be looking at the internal mechanics of the way the Treasury runs, and is supposed to be taking control of funding and looking for cuts. Anyway, there's been a power struggle between Musk and the Treasury staff. The president has backed Musk. He's being given access. Apparently, there's an order now requiring the Treasury to provide him with full access to all the internal money, the accounts and all of that kind of thing. The most senior permanent official of the Treasury has apparently now resigned. He was briefly Assistant acting Secretary of the Treasury after Janet Yellen stepped down, but now he's gone, and it looks as if Elon Musk is going to conduct, or is intending to conduct, not the same thing as saying that he is going to conduct, but he's intending to conduct a root and branch examination of the way in which the US Treasury Department has been functioning. Now this, by the way, has important foreign policy implications. One of the key departments of the Treasury, one of the most aggressive departments, is the Department of the Treasury which proposes and enacts and enforces the various sanctions that the US government has been imposing and implementing on all sorts of countries around the world. I get the sense sometimes that this particular team inside the Treasury that has been running the US's sanctions policy has become almost a law unto itself. It's an iron law of bureaucracy, by the way. These are governmental bureaucracies. I say this having worked on the fringes of two government bureaucracies. It is an iron law of bureaucracies that they are constantly seeking to expand their influence and their power, and indeed their size. And as I said, this department within the Treasury that has been tasked with sanctions policy is a case in point. And of course, some years ago, about 20 years ago, as part of legislation that was initially directed at combating money laundering practices, mostly by the various cartels that operate in Latin America. Just saying. The whole concept of secondary sanctions was launched, and these people in the Treasury have been working very hard to enact and implement and enforce secondary sanctions of a strictly political nature, involving more and more countries around the world in a way which, as I have pointed out many times, has caused enormous disruption to the efficient conduct of international trade. I will be very interested to see whether Musk and his team at Dodge ever get to reach this particular department of the Treasury, and whether there's going to be the usual bureaucratic battle and who will win between these very powerful, overpowerful people within the Treasury. And anyway, we will see what they do. And of course, the State Department is also subject to purges of its own. Not just the State Department, but the sprawling network of agencies that it has basically been running. We've seen how the effect of Secretary Rubio's stop order is having a crippling effect or freezing effect, not just on the various agencies that have been supporting and funding Ukraine, but on many of the various agencies and NGOs and civil society agencies, as they call themselves, that operate in all kinds of countries and which cumulatively come together and form what you might call the colour revolution community, the people who have been busy promoting democracy, as they call it, all around the world. Anyway, they're apparently in crisis. I understand that the website at USAID has now stopped working, or at least is frozen, and there is talk that USAID is going to be massively stripped down and is going to be brought under straight bureaucratic control by the State Department, or whoever is left in the State Department once the various purges there are completed. And anyway, the very fact that USAID is being subordinated to the official bureaucracy in this kind of way of course, that destroys the fiction that it is an independent agency that does its own thing, that it's not really implementing policies, even as it conducts all kinds of policies of the US government in all sorts of places, that it's really an independent agency, separate from the US government, able to attract funds from outside the US government, even as it does all the various things it's been doing in all kinds of places. So, again, it's early days. We don't know how far this purge is going to go. There's much talk that legal challenges will eventually be launched against this extraordinary program of firing people that is taking place across the US government. But the New York Times recently said that the administration, far from being afraid of lawsuits, is actually looking forward to them, that it has adopted the unitary theory of the US government, that the president and the vice president are the only elected officials within the US government, that everyone else works to their bidding, and that the president, as chief of the executive, therefore has a constitutional right to fire and hire anyone he chooses, and that any attempts to restrict the president's right to do that is unconstitutional. And apparently, the president and his lawyers are confident that if these cases are indeed brought, eventually the Supreme Court of the United States will side with them, that it will endorse the unitary theory of the Constitution, in which case, of course, Donald Trump will have literally untrammeled power to fire anyone that he wishes. And, well, all of this is going on in Washington, and as I've already said, there's been talk about changes to the whole character of US foreign policy. This is what Marco Rubio was saying in that interview. But over the next couple of days, we're going to see these tariffs start to be imposed on various trading partners of the United States. Canada, Mexico, China. Canada and Mexico are the two countries that are going to be hit with the heaviest sanctions, but China is going to have to face sanctions as well. And already there is talk that the administration has the European Union as well on its list of targets for sanctions, with the president talking about tariffs as the way forward, reaching back to the period before the World Wars, when the United States developed its industries behind high protective tariffs and basically traded with the rest of the world on its own terms. Now, if all of these things are implemented, and as I said, we're in the very first days of this administration, it may be that this all comes unstuck. It could be that the legal challenges will be too strong. It could be that the inflationary consequences of the tariffs will undermine support within the United States for these policies. All kinds of things could happen. And if I have to be honest, I would say that they not only will happen, but that it's most unlikely that the president and his officials will achieve all of the things that they're trying to do. But if this direction of travel continues, and it is meeting astonishingly little opposition and resistance at the moment, which makes one feel that in some ways there's a kind of rightness to these moves, that they reflect the deeper wishes of large sections of US society. And in the Financial Times, for example, there's been more articles which say that many of these policies, including the tariff policies and the cuts the attendant cuts on corporate and personal taxes are being well received by part of the business community in the United States. Anyway, if even part of these plans are implemented successfully, then we are looking at a complete revolution in the way in which the United States conducts its affairs. Now, I know many people are going to say that this cannot happen, that the oligarchy of the United States, the various power structures, will resist and will defeat all of these attempts at changes, and quite possibly they are right. This could be a brief revolution that rapidly hits the buffers and ultimately fails. This has happened in many places, and you could say that it's not going to be that different on this occasion. But I am going to say that what is happening in the United States is not actually entirely without precedent. In other places, when empires have become overextended, when the government, or at least some people at the center of power, begin to understand how overextended the empire has become and that the present course is unsustainable, something similar has been attempted, and perhaps the best example of this and the closest precedent is Britain in the first decades of the 20th century. The British Empire had grown remorselessly in size throughout the 19th century. Britain, throughout most of the 19th century, had become by far, and was by far, the world's richest and most powerful country. But by the late 19th century, by the early 20th century, it had become clear that Britain was no longer paramount in the same way that it was. The United States had overtaken it in industrial strength, and it was starting to face competition from rising great powers, Germany in particular, but also to some extent Russia, with which the British were struggling to compete. And in the first decades of the 20th century, the British started to change and adapt their policies and started to do some of the same things that the Trump administration is trying to do in the United States at the moment. The key figure in this great shift in British policy was a British politician completely forgotten by most people in Britain today and virtually unknown outside Britain, Joseph Chamberlain, who was a colonial secretary for some of this period, and who was, by the way, the father of Neville Chamberlain. Anyway, Joseph Chamberlain in 1902 made a famous speech in which he spoke of Britain as the weary Titan which staggered under the too vast orb of its fate. He said that Britain had borne the burden for many years and it was time to look for external help. He made those comments addressed to Britain's colonies, apparently, but everybody at the time knew that he was actually talking about the Americans, first and foremost, the United States. He was looking to try and draw the United States, about which he often spoke, into the system of maintaining the dominance, if you like, the global dominance of the Anglophone world. And he also increasingly saw the empire more as a sphere of influence of Britain, sought to connect it more tightly to the British metropolis, to the British centre, spoke about creating high protective barriers to protect British industry, whilst extracting wealth from the empire through a policy of so-called imperial preference, something not so different from what Trump is currently talking about, entirely reversing the previous policy, the previous British policy of free trade. And of course, Chamberlain came in for much criticism. People said that his policies were going to be inflationary. It took a long, long time before all the things that Joseph Chamberlain was advocating were fully adopted. But in the early 1930s, they finally were. The entire structure that Chamberlain had been advocating, imperial preference, protection, devaluation of the currency. Sterling was taken off the gold standard, and the British completely changed the whole character, the whole monetary policies that the British government until then had been following. A refocus on industrial growth within Britain itself. All of that was adopted in Britain from about 1930 and continued to shape British economic policy for a very long time, as late as the early 1970s, as I remember very well elements of imperial preference, of the trading policies that basically Joseph Chamberlain had authored, continued to influence the way the British ran their trading relations with the outside world. So, as I said, this isn't completely unprecedented. What the United States is, or at least the Trump administration is trying to do, which is not to say, of course, that it will be successful. Whether it will be successful remains to be seen. But certainly we are in the middle, or at least at the start, perhaps more correctly, of a major attempted shift, which is now underway. And that is an important fact in global affairs. And if we're talking about the practical effects of that, again, very much has happened with the British in the early 20th century when they started to look for ways to reduce the level of global competition with the other empires, so that the British in the first decade of the 20th century came to arrangements with the French about Africa, arrangements with the Russians about the Middle East, and in particular Iran. So I suspect the current administration is also trying to find ways to try to mitigate great power competition by gradually retreating from places like Ukraine, which it now recognizes are examples of imperial overreach. And that brings me to the last point in this slightly discursive opening to this program, which is that, of course, the United States behaving in this way, this period of retrenchment and reorganization that we are seeing, which, as I said, is not unique for empires that have become overextended. Well, this is a product also of the rise of other great powers. And I've spoken many times in many programs about the revolutionary effect in the global system of the rise of China since the early 1990s, the explosive growth of the Chinese economy and its success in overtaking the United States as the world's leading manufacturing power. But the other factor, the other single factor that has changed the global picture radically since the 1990s, since the unipolar heyday of the 1990s, is the return of Russia as a great power. This is not something that is generally acknowledged. But in the 1990s, people had stopped thinking of Russia as a great power. And then, from the 1990s, Russia came back. The first commentator, international affairs analyst to see that, by the way, was the French scholar Emmanuel Todd. And about that, he was absolutely right. And in fact, since 1998, the 1998 financial crisis in Russia, since Putin's emergence as Russia's leader, we have seen a steady revival of Russian power, which has been as dramatic and as rapid in its own way as the return of China has been. So that we now have a situation where Russia not only is once again clearly a great power, but where many of the myths about it are being refuted. We see that its economy is much more resilient and diverse than people had imagined. We've seen the major revival of its manufacturing industries and technologies to the point where it can outproduce the entire West in terms of weapons production, producing 3 times more weapons in a year than the entire collective West is able to do, and where its army has been able to take on the entire resources, aggregate resources of the collective West in Ukraine, and has been able to keep on winning. And that, of course, as well as this revival, this appearance of Chinese power, has been one of the major factors that has led to this huge change in international relations that we have seen, and this return to multipolarity, to a system of several great powers, and to the changes that are currently underway in the United States. Nobody should be under any illusions about this. If we had not had the crisis in Ukraine, if it had not played out in the way that it has done, if the Russians were not about to win the war in Ukraine against all of the efforts that the United States and its European allies, every effort that they have made, we would not be seeing the changes in the United States that we are seeing now. Most probably, Donald Trump would not have been re-elected American president. Just saying. Well, anyway, I'm not going to say more. As I said, it's not usual for me to indulge in these, tours d'horizon, as the French like to call them. That, at least, is my understanding of the changes that are taking place in the world. Whether or not the changes that we see in the United States ultimately are successful, the retreat into spheres of influence, the creation of the big tariff walls, which, by the way, mean the end of the collective West. One can no longer speak of the West as a single collective project in the way that it once previously was. And these attempts to try to withdraw from this losing conflict in Ukraine and to reorient US foreign policy away from Europe. As I said, it's far from clear that all of this will succeed. But the very fact that it is being attempted at all is, as I said, a product of the huge changes that have taken place in the international system in the last 3 decades. And just to say, at the core of them, at the core of all of these changes, is one very unusual and very remarkable individual Vladimir Putin, who in terms of European diplomacy and his effect on international affairs has had a seminal significance, placing him at the same level as, say, Bismarck. Anyway, let's now look at the things that are actually taking place, and let's again focus at that major conflict, which, as I said, is at the core of what is taking place everywhere else, and which has been the catalyst of all of this change. And I mean, of course, the conflict in Ukraine. Well, it has become very obvious to me over the last 24 hours that the United States, perhaps taking its hint from Putin, is now trying to find some means to get rid of Vladimir Zelensky. I say that because Trump's envoy, General Kellogg, has now started thinking aloud about what a great idea it would be if Ukraine were to have elections this year, parliamentary and presidential elections, that this would be the normal thing for a democracy to do. Democracies, after all, and here Kellogg could point to the United States, do conduct elections in wartime periods. Not all democracies, but certainly the United States conducted democracies during wars. They did so during the Civil War, and they did so during the World Wars, and it's perhaps an idea that Ukraine might want to do the same thing. And, well, this would remove the awkwardness and the anomalies that we have seen. And all of this is happening at one and the same time that all sorts of other people have been saying some very critical things about Vladimir Zelensky. So Tucker Carlson, for example, is recently speaking about Zelensky as some sort of dictator, maybe not a complete dictator, but a dictator of some kind. He's not in power as a result of elections. His constitutional term has ended. He's placing restrictions on political life inside Ukraine, all that kind of thing. Tucker Carlson, of course, is not a member of the administration, but he's been a supporter of Donald Trump. And he is also perhaps somewhat on the vanguard intellectually of some of these changes in the United States that we have been seeing. So maybe Tucker Carlson is not just talking for himself here. Maybe he's expressing views that are widely shared. But it's impossible, I think, to see these calls for elections in Ukraine as anything other than coded language about Zelensky himself stepping down. Certainly, some people in Ukraine itself are starting to read these comments coming out of the United States in that kind of way. I understand that a Ukrainian politician who's apparently in disfavor with Zelensky and might even be in prison has actually said so, that these comments coming out of the United States are basically calling time on Zelensky and seem to be intended to undermine the political system in Ukraine. Just saying, destabilize the political system in Ukraine. But the Americans, presumably, when they call for these elections, are reading the opinion polls in Ukraine. And bear in mind, opinion polls in Ukraine are not perhaps fully reliable, and they are likely, given the realities in Ukraine, to overstate, if anything, Zelensky's support. Anyway, they're probably reading the opinion polls, and are coming to realize that if there were elections in Ukraine at any point this year, Zelensky is unlikely, if those elections are conducted properly, to win them and to remain in power. So to me, these calls for elections, parliamentary elections, presidential elections, look like fairly obvious hints from the Americans that Zelensky, who's clearly become something of a problem, or at least the Americans are starting to see him as something of a problem, they want him to step down and to remove himself finally from the scene. Now, this isn't, of course, again, new. In other situations, in other conflicts, where the United States has found itself overcommitted in a particular place, Vietnam, Afghanistan, those sort of places, the Americans have made little secret sometimes of their exasperation with the leader in place, their once favoured and sworn ally. And of course, they've attempted regime change in a few of these cases. I've discussed many times in these programs the coup, the US-backed coup against President Diem of South Vietnam in 1963, which, by the way, was botched and ended up making the political situation in South Vietnam even more unstable and unsatisfactory from an American point of view than it had been previously. Just say. So one can see how all of this might be playing out and that this isn't really new. Zelensky himself is starting to respond to all of this. Today, or rather yesterday, he spoke for the first time about how negotiations are needed and how there should be negotiations. He said absolutely nothing about rescinding his 2nd October 2022 decree prohibiting negotiations, but he seems to be taking the stand that the negotiations can happen despite the decree presumably remaining in place. The one thing he said is that, of course, it would be very dangerous for the negotiations to take place without Ukraine being directly involved. He spoke about his concern that the Americans and the Russians appeared to be talking to each other without Ukraine being consulted. He said that the Ukrainians had only had very general discussions up to now with the Trump people, and that he was worried, he's clearly worried, by Donald Trump's words the other day, the ones that I discussed yesterday, about the fact that the Americans and the Russians are now in discussions about Ukraine and are looking for some kind of peaceful outcome. So Zelensky said that he was worried about that. He said that this was dangerous, that Ukraine absolutely did need to be involved, and he said that the Europeans should be involved in these discussions as well. It's now clear to me that his major priority at the moment is firstly to keep himself in place. He didn't say anything about holding elections, at least not that I'm aware of. But he did, for the first time, acknowledge that negotiations of some kind will have to happen. But he's keen that he has a place in those negotiations, despite Putin's well-known objections discussed by Putin in his recent interview with Pavel Zarubin, and despite the Americans dropping very, very heavy hints now that it's time for him to remove himself from the scene. And he wants to be in those negotiations, and he wants his European friends in the negotiations as well. And of course, it's not difficult to work out what he's trying to do. He's trying to make sure that the negotiations don't actually go anywhere far, yet, as I discussed in my program yesterday, the Russian Deputy Ambassador to the United States, Mr. Polyansky, told Glenn Deason and myself that he personally thinks, speaking as a Russian diplomat, but not on behalf of his government, that it would be better if the Ukrainians and the Europeans were excluded from the negotiations because they are clearly wreckers. And Zelensky, of course, is demanding that the opposite happen, that the Ukrainians and the Europeans should be intimately involved with him still in charge, precisely, one suspects, because Zelensky wants them to be wreckers. So anyway, there it is. I'm going to make a guess. It's not a prediction. It is only a guess. I think more likely than not, this is the last year, 2025, is the last year that Vladimir Zelensky is going to be president of Ukraine. At some point this year, we will see him removed or forced to step down or maneuvered into calling elections he doesn't want, with those elections producing someone else to take his place. As of now, I think it unlikely that at the end of 2025, Zelensky will still be president of Ukraine. The Americans don't want him. The Russians don't want him. I suspect even amongst some of the European leaders, he's outstayed his welcome. And in Ukraine itself, all of the indications are that support for him has, to all intents and purposes, collapsed. And, well, that now brings me to the mood, the general mood in the West about Ukraine. Now, the Americans have imposed their stop order on further aid to Ukraine. Money is not flowing to Ukraine, at least not in the level that it previously did. I think that the Ukrainians are still receiving some American weapons. There were reports, for example, which I'm sure are true, that the Ukrainians have received another 90 Patriot missile interceptors to bolster their air defense system. As I understand it, these systems, these missile interceptors, come ultimately from Israel. And this arrangement, this transfer of these interceptors to Ukraine was previously arranged by the Biden administration in the last weeks of its existence. But there's no suggestion that the Trump people are interfering with this transfer. So Ukraine continues to receive some weapons from the United States, and I suspect quite a lot of shells, just saying. There are also reports that the Ukrainians are continuing to receive some weapon systems from their European friends. The Dutch and the Danes continue to supply Ukraine with F-16 fighter jets. These F-16s have been all but invisible, by the way, in the fighting, at least up till now. I understand the two have been destroyed in the air. Quite plausibly, others have been destroyed on the ground, but certainly they're not making any difference so far in the conduct of the war. Macron is busy putting together his package of supplying the Mirage 2000s to Ukraine. It's not clear how many there are going to be sent, but perhaps 5. The assumption is that they will take the place of the former Soviet-era Sukhoi 24 bombers that were previously used by the Ukrainians and the British to launch the Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles, that the Mirage fighters will take over that role now that most of the Sukhoi 24s have been destroyed. Anyway, Ukraine continues to receive some weapons. It continues to receive verbal support from the Europeans, some of it pretty rhetorically strong. We also, of course, have had the latest announced sanctions package from the European Union. But anybody who is observing the mood in Europe, in Germany, in the United States, anybody who observes it and does so objectively can see that after the American election in November, all conviction has drained out of the whole affair. Nobody, apart perhaps from Keir Starmer in London, believes in this enterprise anymore. The collapse in faith in it is starting to affect the direction of the elections in Germany, and I suspect the political situation in France. Ursula von der Leyen continues in her attempts to keep the Europeans in line, and of course the Baltic states all continue with their overblown rhetoric about Russia. But everywhere else, amongst all of the leading European countries, even in Britain to some extent, everybody can see that the war in Ukraine is being lost, that the Russians are going to win. You still get the odd article that predicts a financial crisis in Moscow, the ultimate collapse of the Russian economy, that kind of thing. And nobody, as a result, any longer really believes in this project any further. And they're all quietly, I think, starting to take steps to distance themselves from an enterprise that has gone horribly wrong. Now, a further example of this is that apparently the Ukrainians, Zelensky's people, have resumed in a major way their lobbying to try to get the Americans and the Europeans to confiscate the frozen Russian assets in Euroclear. Apparently, there's a major Ukrainian effort to persuade Donald Trump that this would be a good idea. There's been no word about this from Washington, and in some respects, you can see the attraction. Donald Trump doesn't want to send any more American money to Ukraine. European governments are losing faith and belief in this enterprise. So why not steal, seize, take Russia's money, use that to buy weapons from the United States mostly, keeping Raytheon and Lockheed and all of these companies busy, and, well, continue the war that way. And you can see that that's what the Ukrainians are trying to tell the Americans, and some people in Washington might even be attracted to this idea. And it is not impossible, knowing Donald Trump, that he might eventually come round to it. However, there are, of course, the perennial objections. It would be plainly illegal. The CEO of Euroclear, where most of this money is located, is adamantly opposed. The Belgian government is unhappy and nervous about this. The German government is nervous about this as well, and that isn't likely to change, it seems, after the elections. And Rubio and Trump must know that if they really do want to move forward with a negotiation with the Russians, then there is a very little they can do which would infuriate and anger the Russians more and put the Russians in a very ugly frame of mind than proceed and move forward to confiscate Russian assets. In fact, it's the worst possible thing that the United States could do, because seizing assets that the Russians aren't able to use isn't going to affect in any way the performance of the Russian economy or Russia's ability to continue the war, but it is likely to deal a massive blow to US-Russian relations, which one senses that the Trump people want to improve, and is going to make the Russians even more determined to press forward with the war, and even less likely to agree any compromises in order to end it. So if Trump is sensible, he will resist these demands, this persuasion from Ukraine. And for the record, I think that is probably what ultimately Trump does intend to do. But the very fact that this proposal, this terrible proposal, is coming up again is perhaps a further sign that the Ukrainians are sensing that support is draining away, that there's not going to be huge sums of money coming from the Americans or the Europeans. American aid has already largely stopped, and that this is the only pot of money left. And if it's, of course, seized, well, it will help Ukraine keep going for a few more months until, well, who knows what. So you can see the temptation, you can see the attraction. But the fact that this idea is being revived is actually basically a sign that we are, in fact, coming close to the end of the affair. Now, how all of this is going to get underway remains to be seen. I think the Trump people are still hoping that the Russians are going to make the first move to call them. I think that at some point the Americans are going to understand that the Russians are in no mood to do that. Their position has consistently been that as it was the United States that cut off and ended all dialogue, so it should be the United States that takes the first steps to resume it. And I'm going to guess that at some point, perhaps in this coming week, we will see the first moves by the Americans finally to get the discussions, the dialogue with the Russians underway. But in the meantime, the war goes on. And here, I'm afraid, we're getting some really distressing news over the last 24 hours. News that I'm going to mention, but I don't intend to discuss. Firstly, I mentioned in my last program that there'd been a massive Russian missile attack across Ukraine, apparently mostly targeting the Ukrainian air defense and energy systems. One missile, and it's not clear whether this was a Russian missile that went astray or an Ukrainian air defense missile. Anyway, one missile hit an apartment building in the eastern city of Poltava in Kharkiv region, which is, by the way, east of the Dnieper. If Kharkiv were ever to be captured by the Russians, Poltava would probably be next, as the Russians move forward in the north towards the Dnieper as well, just saying. But anyway, a missile then hit a residential building in Poltava, and there are reports that civilians were killed. And of course, there's the usual arguments about who was responsible Even more disturbing are reports of a missile strike on a school building in Sudzha, the town in Kursk region, which the Ukrainians captured in August and which they still control. Now, the Ukrainians are saying that this building, in which apparently elderly civilians were hiding, Russian civilians were hiding, was hit by a Russian bomb, a cab bomb. I believe this is not an explosive bomb, but some kind of thermobaric bomb. I'm not sure about that, and I might be wrong. Anyway, that is what the Ukrainians are claiming. The Russians, more disturbingly, are saying that it was a deliberate attack by the Ukrainians, some kind of act of defiance after the Russian allegations about what happened in the village of Ruskaya Porechnoye, which I discussed yesterday, and that the Ukrainians launched HIMARS missile attacks from Sumy region, specifically targeting this building in Sudzha. Now, I am not there. I am not in any kind of position to conduct an investigation. I am not going to try and guess what happened. All I would say is allegations are flying around about this incident. The Russian Defense Ministry has published a very, very stern statement about it, and I expect that the Russians to take further action in purported or perhaps actual retaliation within the next 24 hours. So this is a disturbing event, and dare I say, a very, very tragic one. Should not distract attention, however, from the events that are playing out across the war, because the Russian offensive continues, and there has been an article discussing the Russian offensive by our old friends at the Institute for the Study of War, the think tank in Washington that provides most of the West's commentaries about the war, and which is run by the Kagan, largely run, as far as I can tell, by the Kagan-Nuland family. And anyway, they've now come out and said that the Russians have worked out their battle plans for the next 9 months, taking us, in other words, all the way to the end of this year. And the fact that they've been working out their plans, their battle plans, their offensive battle plans, is a strong sign that the Russians have no plans to end the war anytime soon, that they don't expect any kind of ceasefire, certainly no sort of freeze, and certainly no negotiated outcome to the war before the end of the year. Now, I don't know where our friends at the Institute of the Study of War get this information from. I don't think that Vladimir Putin or General Gerasimov or the Russian Defense Minister Andrei Belousov or the Security Council in Moscow share their plans, their military plans, with the Institute for the Study of War. Just saying. But for the record, I think this is likely to be true. I think that, and in fact my clear impression is that the Russians do plan long in advance the broad details of their military operations. Big Serge, the commentator who writes about Russian-related matters, military matters, has talked about the systematic and thorough way in which the Russians plan their military operations. And I think it is highly likely that the Russians at least have a general idea, probably a fairly detailed idea actually, of how the war is going to evolve over the next 9 months. So I think that the Institute of the Study of War is probably right, though I would also say that I think it's probably guessing when it says that the Russians are planning to conduct their campaign, have already planned out their campaign for the next 9 months. Now here I'm going to say something about my own personal impression about Russian war planning, offensive planning of their military campaign in Ukraine. I read recently a most interesting article on his Substack blog by the former British diplomat Ian Proud. Ian Proud has pointed out, what many other people are pointing out, that the Russians now have captured around half of the famous mineral resources located in Ukraine that people like Senator Lindsey Graham in the United States have been talking about. Now, Lindsey Graham has been saying that the whole point and purpose of the war, as far as the United States has been concerned, is to gain control of Ukraine's mineral wealth. I don't think this is strictly true, actually. I think that American objectives, the original neocon objectives in Ukraine, partly were connected to Ukraine's mineral wealth. But I think mostly they were part of this complex geopolitical game, the grand chessboard and all of that, conceived way back in the 1990s by Zbigniew Brzezinski, weakening Russia, perhaps even breaking it up eventually, so as to isolate China and to pave the way for indefinite US hegemony over the globe. But I think what did start to happen from about last year, especially after the failure of Ukraine's 2023 summer offensive, is that Zelensky and his officials, in order to try to keep the United States on side, went around telling the Americans and maybe some people in Europe as well, well, stick with us, help us to win, we can still win, help us to win, because if you do win, we promise you in advance that you will get your hands on all our enormous mineral resources, our lithium, our manganese, our tungsten, our coking coal, our natural gas, all of that. And that will more than repay you for any money that you are spending on supporting us until then. And of course, people like Lindsey Graham fell for that hook, line, and sinker, as one would expect someone like that to do. That's my own assessment of this. But anyway, it is a fact that since then, and especially over the last couple of months, as the Russian army has steadily moved westwards, more and more of these famous Ukrainian mineral resources have been passing under Russian control. The great lithium deposit near Shevchenko has done so. One of the mines that produces the coking coal apparently has either done so or is about to do so. There's some argument about whether the Russians still do in fact control it. A lot of the mineral resources that used to be Ukrainian are now under Russian control. And in his article on his blog, Ian Proud writes as if this has been a Russian military objective, that as the war presses on, as the prospect of negotiations loom, the Russian army has been pushing and seizing these mineral deposits as part of the overall plan that the General Staff has. Now, I could see why people think that, but I'm going to say straight away that I don't myself think this is the case. I've been following very, very closely now for, 3 years, the way in which the Russians have conducted the war in Ukraine. And I've long since come to the view that most of the key decisions as to how battles are conducted are made by Gerasimov and the General Staff in Moscow, and to some extent, and to a great extent in fact, by the local commanders, by people like Mordvichev, Teplinsky, Lapin, and all of the others. And I think that these people are making their decisions organically based upon the evolution of the military situation on the ground, that they're following, in other words, strictly military priorities, and have little understanding or interest in these broader economic and geological questions that people are talking about. Just saying. The simple fact is that as the Russian army goes on moving westwards, inevitably it is going to take more and more of Ukraine's mineral wealth under Russian control, simply because most of that mineral wealth appears to be located east of the Dnieper River, in the precise area where the Russians are advancing. If we look at the situation on the battlefronts now, again, it seems to me that every single move that the Russians are making can be explained and understood, and should be understood, in strictly military terms. Now, let's do a quick overview again of where we are. I spoke yesterday in my program about the fact that we no longer hear anything anymore about the North Korean soldiers in Kursk region. They've all melted away, they've all disappeared. Kim Jong-un has taken them back to North Korea. There's been no sign of their existence. They were always invisible, and now they've completely vanished. I mean, this whole story, as I said yesterday, the North Koreans in Kursk, is a shabby testament of the collapse in credibility and reporting standards by the media in the West. That doesn't mean that big events are not happening in Kursk region. We're now getting more reports, including detailed reports from Group of Forces North, and they are confirming that there are now fierce fighting going on in Sverdlikovo, the village, the big village to the northwest of the main road to Suja, and that some parts of Sverdlikovo are indeed under Russian control. And it does look as if before long Sverdlikovo is going to pass fully under Russian control. And I said in my program yesterday that the Russians now seem to be active across the border in Ukraine itself, in Sumy region. There's clearly significant Russian forces now operating inside Sumy region, though it's not clear to me where many of them are. But we are gradually moving towards a position where the Ukrainian forces in Kursk region become trapped in a cauldron if the main road is cut. That is exactly what is going to happen. And it is quite likely that when that happens, the Russians will then be able to move forward and will launch an offensive towards the city of Sumy itself. And of course, beyond Sumy is Kiev itself. Now, Group of Forces North, the force that is fighting the Ukrainians in Kursk region, and which is now operating in Sumy region, as I said in many places, many programs, has a most interesting website, or rather I should say Telegram channel, where they provide a huge amount of information about the conduct of the war and provide a running commentary about what is actually going on in the war, which is sometimes very interesting and gives an interesting insight of the Russian military's perspective of things. Anyway, Group of Forces North, I noticed yesterday, confirmed that the area of the high-rise buildings, the citadel area, in other words, in Volchansk, in Kharkiv region, has now come fully under Russian control. Now, this was reported for the first time some weeks ago, but Group of Forces North is now confirming this officially. So the Russians control the industrial area in northern Volchansk, and they control the area of the high-rise buildings. And a short while ago, they captured the village of Tikha, which lies to the extreme east of Volchansk. It seems to me that the Russians now almost certainly do control pretty much all of Volchansk, north of the Volcha River. Around 2/3 of the town. And there are reports, and Group of Forces North has said this, that the Russians have begun raids across the Volcha River into southern Volchansk. And it is likely, it seems to me, that we're going to start to see an offensive play out in Volchansk before very long. So it's probable that we are going to start to see big events take place in this area of the northern battlefields. General Lapin and Group of Forces North have conducted a very interesting war, both in Kharkiv region and in the area of Belgorod and in Kursk region and in Sumy region, against some of the best forces that the Ukrainians still have and which have been launched at them. But it looks as if they're now on the brink of winning this battle, winning the battle in Kursk region, winning the battle in Volchansk, and presumably the nearby village of Lipsy as well, putting the Russians in a position where they might be able to relaunch their offensive towards the city of Kharkiv, if that is what the Russians are really thinking of doing, and putting the Russians in a position where they can launch their operation against the city of Sumy itself, and perhaps ultimately against Kiev also. This is an underreported sector of the war, despite the fact that some of the fighting has been playing out in Russia. And I wonder whether this incident, this really horrible incident that's just happened in Suja at this boarding school, isn't in some way connected with the gathering crisis that the Ukrainians are facing in this area as well. Anyway, everywhere else, things go from bad to worse. It is now, I gather, officially acknowledged that the Russians are in control of something like 2/3 of Chasiv Yar. The Russians are gradually folding the flanks in Chasiv Yar. And we've had lots of reports over the last 24 hours from Toretsk. And it looks as if whatever Ukrainian counterattacks actually did take place in Toretsk have been repelled, and that the Russians are now filling out the spaces between the urban areas of Toretsk that they control and are pushing the Ukrainian troops or surrounding the Ukrainian troops in the various fields located around Toretsk. And yesterday, the Russian Defense Ministry said that the village of Krimsky has come under Russian control, and it's likely that the mine, the Toretsk mine, has come under Russian control. Anyway, one way or the other, it looks as if this entire area, this entire big built-up area, Chasiv Yar, Toretsk, the various places around, are now gradually being cleared so that we can perhaps expect a Russian offensive against the town of Konstantinovka, the big town of Konstantinovka, around 70,000 people, the southern spur of the Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka conurbation, the last big urban conurbation still under Ukrainian control in Donbass. It looks as if that is probably going to start, I'm guessing, sometime in March. Anyway, there we are. So that's the situation there. And over the last couple of hours, there's been some more reports from the Pakrovsk area, suggests that the Russians are now advancing along the railway lines from Kotlevo, which they captured a couple of short time ago. They seem to be pushing towards the western part of Pakrovsk itself, even as they advance to cut off the remaining roads and railway lines into Pakrovsk from the west. And as I've discussed in recent programs, the other major battle that is currently playing out is in the area southwest of Kurakovo, in this cluster of villages to which the garrison, the Ukrainian garrison in Kurakovo withdrew. The Russians appear to be working to surround the Ukrainian troops in these villages and to destroy Ukraine's Kurakovo grouping once and for all. All of these battles, I think, should be seen as basically concluding the Russian offensive that began in October 2023 after the failure of Ukraine's summer offensive of 2023. The Russians began a series of attacks, a major offensive, starting with the capture of first Marinka and then Avdiivka. That has broken Ukrainian defenses in Donbass. The Russians are now in the final stages of completing that offensive that was begun then. And if the Institute for the Study of War is correct, once they've done that, they're likely to begin the next big offensive in the spring. The major objectives being the advance to the Dnieper in the west and the capture of Slavyansk, Kramatorsk and Konstantinovka in the north, in Donbass, and perhaps whatever General Lapin and his people are likely to do in the north once Kursk region has been cleared and Volchansk has been brought fully under Russian control. And of course, all of this will play out even as we get further signs of political crisis in Kiev, even as the Americans start twisting the arms of the politicians in Kiev, trying to get Zelensky to step down. I suspect Zelensky is going to resist every inch of the way, by the way. Not only does his own survival depend on it, but going back to what Simon Schuster said about him in that Time magazine article of a week ago, he appears to have developed a messiah complex, And I don't expect him to go quietly, just saying. But anyway, we're going to see an enormous political crisis develop in Ukraine over the next year. Even as the military crisis deepens, there'll be attempts to get negotiations underway. But on the topic of the negotiations, I'm going to repeat a point I made previously in an earlier program. I think that they have come too late. If negotiations had taken place in the autumn of 2022 or in the spring of 2023, well, it might have been possible to do something at that time. But with all that has happened over the last year, especially since the fall of Avdiivka, with the Russian army driving westwards, with the Ukrainian army melting away, as I discussed in my program yesterday, with the Ukrainian front lines facing a cascading collapse, as the Russian Defense Ministry has said, it's becoming very, very difficult to see why the Russians would want to negotiate at all, and what, from a Russian point of view, those negotiations would be about. A bigger negotiation between the Americans and the Russians about the security situation in Europe or Western Eurasia is certainly an idea, and one that the Russians might consider attractive. But given the shift in American foreign policy that we're seeing play out at the moment, it's not impossible that the Russians are going to be saying to themselves over the next couple of weeks that this negotiation, this big negotiation about the security situation in Europe is going to happen anyway, because American interests dictate that it should. So why make any concessions at all about Ukraine? Well, if that is right, and I'm not absolutely sure that it is, then we will see the price that Europe, to some extent, I suppose, the United States, but Ukraine first and foremost, will have paid for Boris Johnson, Ursula von der Leyen, Joe Biden, and Tony Blinken. Because in all those long, bitter years of the war, from February 2022 until, well, maybe the spring of 2024, when initiating negotiations, maintaining dialogue with the Russians, talking to the Russians, having meetings with them, when all of that might have achieved something, might have found some way to end the war, and could have done so in ways that would have not only preserved Ukraine, but would have avoided the kind of geopolitical defeat that we're now going to see. The Western powers, Boris Johnson, Tony Blinken, Joe Biden, Ursula von der Leyen, Annalena Baerbock, I should remember her, well, they all collectively decided that instead we should do nothing at all. We should sit on our hands, give Ukraine more and more weapons, give Ukraine more and more money, talk about as long as it takes, talk about winning a strategic victory over Russia. The sterility, the nihilism of that foreign policy over those years is now about to exact its price. Well, what I will say is, don't say I didn't say so. I said so in programme after programme, and of course I wasn't the only one. You had Lord Skidelsky in London. You've had any number of people in the United States. You've had people writing in places like the National Interest and Samuel Charap at RAND and at the Council of Foreign Relations. Lots of people were saying, even General Milley in one of his more rational moments were talking about the need for negotiations. That no, we're repeatedly told that this is a wrong thing to do, that one must never repay aggression, that one must always work to defeat the Russians. And here we are, and here we see what the result of that approach has been. As I never cease to remind people, if you play, particularly in war, a game of all or nothing, you risk ending up with nothing. And I would not be at all surprised if that is exactly the position that the Western powers, the Europeans first and foremost, and of course the hapless Ukrainians will find themselves in at the end of this affair. Well, that's me for today. The more from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Don't forget to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel if you've liked this program. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.